The rain had stopped an hour ago, but Daniel could still feel the dampness seeping through his worn jacket. He stood across the street from Bellecourt Restaurant, watching well-dressed people walk in and out of the fancy glass doors. The smell of garlic and herbs drifted across the sidewalk, making his empty stomach twist with hunger. It had been 3 days since his last real meal. 3 days of surviving on stale bread from a bakery dumpster and water from public fountains. His pride had kept him from begging, but pride doesn't fill an empty stomach. The gnawing hunger was getting harder to ignore. Daniel pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders and crossed the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. He had never done anything like this before. 6 months ago, he was living a completely different life. 6 months ago, people knew his name for all the right reasons. The restaurant's entrance was intimidating. Polished brass handles gleamed under the warm lights, and through the large windows, he could see people laughing over expensive wine and perfectly plated food. A valet in a crisp uniform stood by the door, eyeing Daniel suspiciously as he approached. "Excuse me," Daniel said quietly to the valet. "I need to speak with someone inside." The valet looked him up and down, taking in the faded jeans, the scuffed shoes, and the day-old stubble. "I don't think this is the place for you, buddy. Try the McDonald's down the street." But Daniel had already spotted what he came for through the window. In the center of the main dining room sat a beautiful black grand piano. Its polished surface reflected the chandelier lights above, and its keys seemed to call out to him. He hadn't touched a piano in months, not since everything fell apart. "Please," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need 1 minute with the manager." The valet shook his head, but before he could say anything else, a tall man in an expensive suit walked out of the restaurant. This was clearly someone important. The way the valet immediately straightened up made that obvious. "What's the problem here?" the man asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being in charge. "Nothing, Mr. Romano," the valet replied quickly. This gentleman was just leaving. Daniel knew this was his only chance. His heart pounded as he stepped forward. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. I know this might sound strange, but I was wondering." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "Could I play your piano in exchange for a meal?" Mr. Romano's eyebrows shot up. A few people walking past slowed down, sensing drama about to unfold. "You want to what now?" "Play piano." "For food," Daniel repeated, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm a musician and I haven't eaten in days. I saw your piano through the window and I thought maybe... You thought maybe you could just walk into my restaurant and play piano." Mr. Romano's voice grew louder, attracting more attention. "What do you think this is, some kind of charity?" A woman in a designer dress stopped to watch, pulling out her phone. "Oh my God, is this really happening?" she said to her friend. "This is so going on my social media." More people began to gather. Daniel could feel their stares like hot spotlights on his skin. Some looked curious, others disgusted, and a few seemed to be recording with their phones. He wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd and forget this ever happened. But the hunger was stronger than his shame. "I understand how this looks," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering to work. I can play any song you want. Classical, jazz, popular music. Whatever your customers would enjoy." Mr. Romano laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "You think you can just walk in here looking like that and play our piano? Do you have any idea how much that instrument costs? It's worth more than most people make in a year." "I'll be careful with it," Daniel said quietly. "I promise." "Careful?" Mr. Romano's voice rose another notch. "You want me to let some homeless guy put his dirty hands on a $200,000 piano?" The crowd was growing larger now. Daniel could hear whispers and giggles from the people watching. Someone behind him said loudly, "This is so sad. Why doesn't he just get a job like everyone else?" Another voice chimed in, "Probably on drugs. They always have some sob story." Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. He looked past Mr. Romano into the restaurant, where he could see the piano waiting silently in the corner. Beautiful and untouched, like it was begging to be played. "One song," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Give me one song, and if I can't prove I belong at that piano, I'll leave and never come back." "You'll leave anyway," Mr. Romano shot back. "Because I'm calling security right now." He pulled out his phone, but before he could dial, an elderly man emerged from the restaurant. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't laughing or pointing. He was studying Daniel with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Wait," the old man said quietly, but his voice carried enough authority to make Mr. Romano pause. "Let's hear what the young man has to say." Daniel looked at the elderly stranger, surprised by the intervention. The man was well-dressed but not flashy, and something about his presence made the crowd quiet down slightly. "You're a musician?" the old man asked Daniel directly. "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "I've been playing piano since I was 5 years old." "And what happened to bring you here tonight?" It was such a simple question, but it hit Daniel like a punch to the stomach. How could he explain the last 6 months? How could he tell these strangers about the phone call that changed everything? About watching his savings disappear into medical bills? About losing his apartment, his career, his entire life in what felt like minutes? "Life happened," Daniel said finally. "Bad luck and worse timing." The old man nodded like he understood more than Daniel had said. "And you think playing piano might help?" "I think playing piano is the only thing I know how to do anymore," Daniel admitted. "It's all I have left." Mr. Romano was growing impatient. "Look, this is very touching, but I'm running a business here, not a therapy session." "Sir, I respect you as a customer, but I can't let every person who walks in here." "What if he's good?" the old man interrupted. "What if he's really good?" "He's homeless," Mr. Romano said, like that explained everything. "So was Mozart sometimes," the old man replied with a slight smile. "Talent doesn't always come in the package we expect." Daniel felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, someone was actually listening. The crowd was getting restless, phones still recording, waiting to see how this strange scene would play out. Some people were already heading into the restaurant, probably hoping to get good seats for whatever was about to happen. Daniel looked at the piano one more time through the window. He could almost feel the keys under his fingers, could almost hear the music that had been trapped inside him for months. All he needed was one chance. One song to prove that he was more than what people saw when they looked at him. The security guard arrived faster than Daniel expected. He was a big man with broad shoulders and the kind of serious expression that meant business. The crowd of onlookers grew larger, with people stopping their evening walks to see what all the fuss was about. "There a problem here, Mr. Romano?" the security guard asked, his hand resting casually on his radio. "Just removing an unwanted visitor," Mr. Romano replied, pointing at Daniel. "He thinks he can waltz in here and play our piano for food." "Can you believe that?" A woman in a fur coat laughed loudly. "Oh my goodness, really? What's next? Is he going to ask to cook in the kitchen too?" She held up her phone, making sure to get Daniel in the frame. "This is going straight to my followers. They won't believe this." Daniel felt his face burn with shame, but he stood his ground. The elderly man who had spoken up for him was still there, watching everything with those sharp eyes. Something about the way he looked at Daniel made him feel like maybe not everyone thought this was a joke. "Look," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not asking for anything crazy. Just a chance to show what I can do. If you don't like what you hear, I'll leave immediately." "What you can do?" A young man in an expensive suit pushed forward in the crowd. "Dude, you look like you haven't showered in a week. You think we want to hear whatever noise you might make?" The crowd laughed and more phones came out. Daniel could see himself becoming one of those viral videos people share to make themselves feel better about their own lives. The thought made his stomach sink even lower than the hunger already had. Mr. Romano crossed his arms. "You want to know what I think? I think you saw an expensive restaurant and figured you'd try your luck with some sob story. Well, it's not going to work here." "That's not what this is," Daniel said quietly, but his voice was getting lost in the noise of the crowd. A teenager near the back shouted, "Just call the cops already. This is taking forever." "Yeah," someone else agreed. "Some of us have dinner reservations." The security guard stepped closer to Daniel. "All right, buddy, time to move along. You're causing a scene." But before anyone could do anything else, a woman's voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "What exactly is going on out here?" Everyone turned to see a woman in her 50s walking out of the restaurant. She was dressed in chef's whites with her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. Everything about her said she was in charge, and the way Mr. Romano immediately straightened up confirmed it. "Ms. Bellecourt," Mr. Romano said quickly. "Nothing to worry about. Just handling a small situation." So this was the owner, Daniel realized. The woman the restaurant was named after. She looked at the crowd, then at Daniel, then back at Mr. Romano with the kind of expression that could freeze water. A small situation that requires half the neighborhood to watch? She asked. Tony, you know I don't like drama outside my restaurant. It's bad for business. This man, Mr. Romano gestured at Daniel, wants to play our piano for food. I was just explaining why that's not possible. Ms. Bellecourt looked Daniel up and down, taking in every detail of his appearance. Her gaze was calculating, like she was trying to figure out what kind of person he really was. You play piano? She asked him directly. Yes, ma'am, Daniel replied. I've been playing for most of my life. And you're hungry? Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. So you thought you'd come to my restaurant and offer to entertain my customers in exchange for a meal? I thought maybe if I could show you what I can do. Daniel started, but she held up a hand to stop him. Do you see that piano in there? She pointed through the window. That's a 1923 Steinway Model M. It belonged to my grandmother, who was a concert pianist in Italy before she came to America. It's worth more money than most people see in their entire lives. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Someone whispered, I told you this guy was crazy. Ms. Bellecourt continued. My grandmother always said that piano could tell if someone was worthy of playing it. She claimed it would only sound beautiful for musicians who truly understood music. Daniel's heart jumped. Maybe she was about to give him a chance. Of course, Ms. Bellecourt added with a cold smile. My grandmother also believed in fairy tales. In the real world, expensive instruments need to be protected from people who might damage them. The crowd laughed again, harder this time. Daniel felt like he was shrinking into himself. Look at you, she continued. When's the last time you washed your hands? When's the last time you had a real job? You expect me to let you touch something that valuable? I would be very careful. Daniel started. Careful? Ms. Bellecourt's voice rose. You know what careful looks like? Careful looks like years of training. Careful looks like respect for the instrument. Careful looks like having enough respect for yourself to take care of your appearance before asking strangers for favors. Each word hit Daniel like a physical blow. He could see people in the crowd nodding along, some filming his humiliation with obvious enjoyment. This is so sad, a woman near the front said loudly. I feel bad for him, but honestly, what did he expect? He should try getting a job at a fast food place, how another person suggested. They're always hiring. Assuming he can pass a background check, someone else added with a snort. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. 6 months ago, people had paid hundreds of dollars just to hear him play. Critics had written reviews, calling his performances transcendent and unforgettable. Now he was standing on a sidewalk while strangers made jokes about his life, falling apart. But through all the noise and laughter, he noticed the elderly man was still watching him with that same thoughtful expression. Their eyes met for a moment, and Daniel saw something there that looked almost like recognition. Ms. Bellecourt was still talking. You want my advice? Stop looking for handouts and start looking for real work. The world doesn't owe you anything just because you claim you can play piano. I don't claim I can play, Daniel said, finally finding his voice again. I know I can play, and if you gave me just 5 minutes, I could prove it to everyone here. 5 minutes? Ms. Bellecourt laughed. You think 5 minutes on my grandmother's piano would solve your problems? No, Daniel said quietly. But it might solve yours. The crowd went silent. Even Ms. Bellecourt looked surprised. Excuse me? She said. Daniel looked through the window at the beautiful piano sitting silent and untouched in the corner of the dining room. When's the last time anyone played it? Ms. Bellecourt's expression flickered for just a moment. That's not the point, isn't it? Daniel asked. You have one of the most beautiful instruments in the city, and it just sits there like decoration. Your grandmother wouldn't have wanted that. For the first time since this whole thing started, Ms. Bellecourt seemed at a loss for words. The crowd was watching the exchange like a tennis match, waiting to see who would win this verbal battle. The elderly man chose that moment to step forward. Perhaps, he said in his quiet but commanding voice, we should let the young man try. All eyes turned to the elderly man who had just spoken. He wasn't tall or particularly imposing, but something about him made everyone listen when he talked. Even Ms. Bellecourt seemed to hesitate before responding. With all due respect, sir, she said carefully, this isn't really your decision to make. The old man smiled gently. Of course not, but I've been coming to your restaurant for 3 years now, and I've never once heard that beautiful piano played. Seems like a waste, doesn't it? Daniel noticed how the man's voice carried a subtle authority. Other customers were nodding along, and even some of the people in the crowd looked thoughtful. "That piano is for special occasions," Ms. Bellecourt said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "What could be more special than giving someone a chance?" the elderly man asked. He looked directly at Daniel. "Young man, what would you play if given the opportunity?" Daniel's mind raced. This was the moment he had been hoping for, but now that it was here, the pressure felt overwhelming. The crowd was still watching, phones still recording, waiting to see if he would embarrass himself. "Anything you'd like to hear," Daniel said. "Classical, jazz, modern music. Whatever feels right in the moment." A woman in the crowd called out, "Play something we actually know, not some weird classical stuff nobody cares about." "Yeah," her friend agreed. "Play something from the radio." But Daniel was looking at Ms. Bellecourt, trying to read her expression. He could see she was torn between her protective instincts for the piano and curiosity about what might happen. "One song," Daniel said quietly, speaking directly to her. "Just one. If I damage anything, if I embarrass myself, if your customers complain, I'll leave immediately and never bother you again." "And if you don't embarrass yourself?" Ms. Bellecourt asked. "Then maybe we can talk about that meal." The crowd was getting restless. Someone shouted, "Just let him try. This is taking forever." Another person yelled, "Yeah, let's see what happens." Daniel could tell that the crowd's energy was shifting. What had started as mockery was turning into curiosity. People were actually interested in seeing what would happen next. Mr. Romano stepped closer to Ms. Bellecourt. "Boss, I really don't think this is a good idea. What if he breaks something? What if he makes a scene inside?" "He's already making a scene outside," she replied, looking around at the crowd that had gathered. "At least if we move this inside, we can control it better." The elderly man nodded approvingly. "Wise thinking." Ms. Bellecourt studied Daniel's face for a long moment. He could see her weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Finally, she sighed deeply. "Against my better judgment," she said, "I'm going to give you exactly one chance, one song. But there are conditions." Daniel's heart jumped. "Anything. First, you wash your hands thoroughly before you touch my grandmother's piano. Second, if even one customer complains, you stop immediately. Third, if I think you're not treating the instrument with proper respect, you're out. And fourth," she paused, looking him straight in the eye, "if you waste this opportunity, if you play poorly or make my restaurant look bad, you're banned from ever coming near this place again." "I understand," Daniel said, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. The crowd began moving toward the restaurant entrance. People were calling friends, texting about what was happening, eager to get good seats for whatever was about to unfold. "This is either going to be really good or really embarrassing," someone said as they walked past Daniel. "Either way, it's going to be entertaining," their friend replied. Ms. Bellecourt led the way into the restaurant with Daniel following close behind. His legs felt shaky, whether from hunger or nerves, he couldn't tell. The elderly man walked beside him, offering a quiet word of encouragement. "Don't let them intimidate you," the old man said softly. "Just play from your heart." Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was electric. Regular diners looked up from their meals, confused by the sudden influx of people and the buzz of excitement. Servers stopped what they were doing to watch. Even the kitchen staff peered out through the service window. The piano sat in the center of it all, elegant and imposing. Daniel had been looking at it through the window, but seeing it up close took his breath away. The wood was polished to a mirror shine, and the keys looked like they had been carved from ivory. This was an instrument that deserved respect. "The bathroom is over there," Ms. Bellecourt said, pointing toward the back of the restaurant. "Wash your hands properly. Use soap." Daniel nodded and made his way through the crowd. In the bathroom, he scrubbed his hands until they were red, trying to get every trace of dirt from under his fingernails. He looked at himself in the mirror and almost lost his nerve. His face was gaunt from not eating regularly. His hair was messy and his clothes looked even worse under the bright bathroom lights. But his hands looked clean. His fingers were long and strong, the same fingers that had once been described in a newspaper review as magic touching the keys. Those fingers hadn't forgotten how to play, even if everything else in his life had fallen apart. When he returned to the main dining room, he was surprised to see how many people had gathered. The crowd from outside had followed them in, and other diners had moved their chairs to get better views. Someone had even started live streaming on their phone. "All right," Miss Bellecourt announced to the room. "This gentleman has asked for the chance to play our piano. We're going to give him exactly one song to prove himself." A few people clapped politely, but most just watched and waited. Daniel approached the piano bench slowly. The seat was the perfect height, and when he placed his hands on the keys without pressing them, the familiar feeling of home washed over him. This was where he belonged. This was who he was, underneath all the pain and struggle of the past few months. "What are you going to play?" someone called out. Daniel looked out at the faces watching him. Some were curious, some skeptical, a few openly hoping he would fail so they could have a good story to tell later. But in the back, he saw the elderly man watching with patient, encouraging eyes. "Something that means something," Daniel said quietly. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the pressure and the noise and the fear. When he opened them again, he felt calmer. His fingers found their position on the keys, and for the first time in months, Daniel felt like himself again. The first note rang out clear and true, filling the restaurant with sound. It was a simple note, but it carried weight and intention. The second note followed, then the third. And suddenly, Daniel wasn't thinking about hunger or homelessness or the people watching him. He was just playing music. The melody he chose was one his grandmother had taught him when he was 8 years old. It wasn't famous or complicated, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. As his fingers moved across the keys, finding their rhythm and confidence, the restaurant began to change around him. Conversations stopped. Phones lowered. Even the servers stood still, caught up in something they hadn't expected to hear. As Daniel's fingers moved across the keys, something magical began to happen in the restaurant. The simple melody he had started with grew more complex, weaving through emotions that everyone in the room could feel but couldn't quite name. A woman who had been laughing at him just minutes earlier found herself wiping away tears. She didn't understand why the music was affecting her so deeply, but she couldn't look away from Daniel's hands dancing across the piano. The melody shifted, becoming more powerful. Daniel wasn't just playing notes anymore, he was telling a story. It was the story of a young boy who had discovered music and fell in love with it completely. It was the story of years spent practicing until his fingers bled, of teachers who believed in him, of dreams that seemed impossible until they suddenly weren't. A businessman in an expensive suit had been checking his phone when the music started, but now he sat frozen with the device halfway to his ear. The melody reminded him of something from his childhood, a time when he had wanted to be a musician before life convinced him to choose a more practical path. Ms. Bellecourt stood near the kitchen door, her arms crossed, watching Daniel with an expression that had completely changed from suspicion to amazement. This wasn't just someone who could play piano. This was someone who understood music in a way that very few people ever did. The song began to tell a darker part of the story. The notes became sadder, more desperate. Daniel was sharing his pain through the music, letting everyone feel what it was like to lose everything you thought was permanent. The melody spoke of phone calls that changed everything, of watching dreams crumble, of being forced to choose between pride and survival. A teenage girl who had been recording everything on her phone slowly lowered the device. She had expected to capture something funny or embarrassing to share with her friends, but this felt too personal, too real to turn into entertainment. The elderly man who had spoken up for Daniel was standing perfectly still, his eyes closed, listening with the kind of attention that people usually reserve for prayer. There was something about his expression that suggested he recognized more than just good music. He recognized genuine talent. Daniel's playing grew more intense. His whole body was involved now, swaying slightly with the rhythm, his face showing every emotion the music contained. He was pouring 6 months of pain and frustration and fear into the keys, but also something else: hope. A server had been carrying a tray of dishes when the music started. She had stopped walking and was now standing completely motionless, afraid that even the sound of her breathing might disturb what was happening. The melody began to climb, note by note, like someone pulling themselves out of a deep hole. It spoke of refusing to give up, of believing that better days were possible even when everything seemed hopeless. The music was saying what Daniel couldn't say with words, that losing everything had taught him what really mattered. Mr. Romano, who had been so eager to throw Daniel out earlier, was now staring with his mouth slightly open. He had heard plenty of piano music in his life, but nothing like this. This wasn't just background music for a restaurant. This was something that belonged in a concert hall. A couple on their anniversary dinner had forgotten all about their food. They were holding hands across the table, both crying, remembering what it felt like to fall in love and wondering when they had stopped really listening to each other. Daniel's fingers found the highest notes on the piano, creating a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the restaurant. The music was building to something, promising that the story wasn't over, that the sad parts were leading somewhere beautiful. A chef had come out of the kitchen, still holding a wooden spoon, completely mesmerized by what he was hearing. He had been cooking for 20 years, and he understood what it meant to put your soul into your work. He could hear that same dedication in Daniel's playing. The melody reached its peak and then began to settle into something peaceful. It was the sound of someone who had been through hell, but had chosen to keep believing in beauty. The notes seemed to say that music could heal things that nothing else could touch. Ms. Bellecourt found herself thinking about her grandmother, the woman who had owned this piano decades ago. Her grandmother had always said that the right musician could make the instrument sing, could pull emotions from its strings that most people didn't even know they had. A little boy who had been getting restless during his family's dinner was now sitting perfectly still, his eyes wide with wonder. He didn't understand what the music meant, but he could feel that something important was happening. The song was reaching its conclusion, but instead of ending abruptly, Daniel let it fade slowly, like a sunset that doesn't want to disappear. The final notes hung in the air long after his fingers had left the keys, as if the piano itself was reluctant to let the music go. The silence that followed was complete. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The entire restaurant sat frozen in the moment, trying to process what they had just experienced. Daniel sat on the piano bench, his hands resting in his lap, looking drained but peaceful. He had given everything he had to that song, and now he waited to see how people would respond. The first sound came from the elderly man, who began clapping slowly and deliberately. The sound echoed through the silence like a bell, and gradually other people joined in. The applause started quiet and respectful, but it grew stronger as more people found their voices. A woman in the back of the room was crying openly now, not caring who saw her tears. The music had reminded her of her father, who had died the year before, and for a few minutes she had felt like he was there with her again. The businessman was clapping with tears running down his cheeks, thinking about the guitar that was gathering dust in his closet, and wondering if it was too late to remember who he used to want to be. Ms. Bellecourt was the last to start clapping, but when she did, her applause was firm and steady. She was looking at Daniel with an expression that was completely different from the one she had worn earlier. This wasn't the same man who had stood outside her restaurant begging for food. This was an artist. The teenage girl who had been filming everything realized her phone was still recording and quickly stopped the video. What she had captured felt too precious to share carelessly with the world. Daniel looked out at the faces watching him, and for the first time in months, he saw something other than pity, or suspicion, or fear. He saw respect. He saw recognition. He saw people who understood that they had just witnessed something special. The elderly man stepped forward, still clapping, his eyes bright with what looked like unshed tears. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the restaurant. "That was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." Daniel stood up slowly from the piano bench, his legs shaky from the emotional intensity of the performance. He looked around the room at all the faces watching him, and he realized that everything had changed. In the space of one song, he had gone from being a homeless man begging for food to being a musician who had just moved an entire room to tears. But the biggest change was in Daniel himself. For the first time since his world had fallen apart, he remembered who he really was underneath all the pain and struggle. He was a musician, and no matter what else happened, no one could take that away from him. The applause continued for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Daniel stood beside the piano, overwhelmed by the response. He had poured everything into that performance, and seeing how it touched people reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. The elderly man approached him slowly, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. There was something in his expression that looked almost like recognition. as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. "What did you say your name was?" the old man asked quietly. "Daniel," he replied, still catching his breath from the emotional intensity of playing. "Daniel what?" "Daniel Rivers." The elderly man's face went completely pale. He took a step back, staring at Daniel like he had seen a ghost. Several people nearby noticed the reaction and moved closer to hear what was happening. "Daniel Rivers," the old man repeated slowly. "The Daniel Rivers who graduated from Berklee College of Music 3 years ago." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Nobody had recognized him since he had been living on the streets. His appearance had changed so much that even people who had known him before walked right past him without a second glance. "Yes," Daniel said carefully. "How did you—" The Daniel Rivers who was supposed to perform at the Kennedy Center before. The old man's voice trailed off as understanding dawned on his face. The restaurant had gone quiet again. Everyone could sense that something important was happening, even if they didn't understand what it was. "Before my mother got sick," Daniel finished quietly. "Before I had to choose between my career and paying for her medical treatment." The old man nodded slowly, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and amazement. "I'm Professor William Hayes," he said. "I teach at the conservatory downtown. I was supposed to be at your Kennedy Center performance. When you canceled and then disappeared completely, the entire music community wondered what had happened to you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were pulling out their phones, searching for Daniel Rivers, pianist, and finding articles and videos from a few years ago. The contrast between the polished young musician in those photos and the man standing before them now was shocking. Ms. Bellecourt stepped forward, her face showing complete bewilderment. "You're telling me that this man is actually a professional pianist?" Professor Hayes nodded. "Not just professional. Daniel was considered one of the most promising young talents in classical music. Critics were calling him the next great American pianist." A woman in the crowd gasped as she found a video on her phone. "Oh my God, this is really him. I'm looking at a performance from 2 years ago. He looks so different, but listen to this." She held up her phone and Daniel's recorded music filled the restaurant. It was the same talent, the same passion, but captured in a different time when his life was completely different. The teenage girl who had been filming earlier looked at her phone screen, then at Daniel, then back at her phone. "I can't believe I almost posted this as a joke. This guy is actually famous." "Was famous," Daniel corrected softly. "I haven't performed professionally in over a year." Professor Hayes studied Daniel's face with concern. "What happened to you?" "You just vanished. Your agent said you had family issues, but nobody knew the details." Daniel took a deep breath. This was the story he had been avoiding telling anyone, but somehow, in this room full of strangers who had just heard him pour his heart out through music, it felt safe to share the truth. "My mother was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer," he said. "The treatment wasn't covered by insurance and it was experimental, expensive. I had some money saved, but not nearly enough, so I started selling things. First my car, then my apartment, then my instruments." The room was completely silent, hanging on every word. "The treatments worked for a while," Daniel continued. "She got better and I thought maybe I could rebuild my career. But then the cancer came back, worse than before. The medical bills just kept coming. And I kept paying them because what else do you do when it's your mother?" Ms. Bellecourt had tears in her eyes. "Is she—" "She's alive," Daniel said with a small smile. "She's in a care facility now, stable but needing constant monitoring. The bills are still coming, but at least she's safe." Professor Hayes shook his head sadly. "You gave up everything for her." "I didn't give up anything," Daniel said firmly. "I made a choice. Music will always be there, but I only have one mother." A businessman who had been moved to tears by the performance stepped forward. "What's your mother's name? What facility is she in?" Daniel looked surprised by the question. "Why do you ask?" "Because," the man said, pulling out his business card, "I run a foundation that helps families with medical expenses. What you just did here, what you sacrificed for your family, that's exactly the kind of situation we were created to help with." More people were stepping forward now. The woman with the fur coat who had been mocking Daniel earlier approached with her phone in her hand. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice shaking. "I was horrible to you outside and I'm ashamed of myself. But I want to make it right. I'm posting about what happened here tonight, but not to make fun of you. I'm posting to help you." She showed him her phone screen. where she was typing a message to her thousands of social media followers about the incredible musician who had sacrificed his career for his mother and was now trying to rebuild his life. Ms. Bellecourt wiped her eyes and walked over to Daniel. "I don't just owe you a meal," she said. "I owe you a job. Would you consider playing here regularly? I think my grandmother's piano has been waiting for someone like you." Professor Hayes was already making phone calls. "Daniel, the music world has been wondering what happened to you for 2 years. Give me 24 hours and I'll have concert bookings and recording offers coming in. Your career isn't over. It's just been on pause." The elderly man who had first spoken up for Daniel was smiling broadly. "Sometimes," he said to the room, "we get the chance to witness something truly special. Tonight we didn't just hear beautiful music. We witnessed the power of human resilience and love." Daniel looked around the restaurant at all these people who had gone from mocking him to supporting him in the span of an hour. The transformation felt surreal, but he knew it was real because he could feel it in his chest, the same feeling he used to get after a perfect performance. "There's just one thing I need to do first," Daniel said, pulling out an old, cracked phone. "I need to call my mother and tell her that things are about to get better." As he dialed the number, the restaurant full of strangers who had become supporters waited quietly, giving him space for the most important call he would make in months. "Mom," Daniel said when she answered. "It's me. I have some good news to share." And for the first time in a very long time, that was completely true.